My name is Jay Barnson. I think I'm probably the oldest fart here, but
I'm 41.
Oh yeah, I got you beat by about 8 years. That's right. I started out actually right out of college in the video games industry, making games for it was then kind of under code name, but at the time it would become the Sony PlayStation, and I worked on Twisted Metal, Warhawk, Jet Moto. And then I've worked on a whole bunch of things since in the video game arena, a couple of licensed products, Animorphs, for those of you old enough to remember those books.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah, anyway, we did the...
we did a book report on those.
Oh, okay. Well, we did the PlayStation video game based on that. Ian, get off of my lawn! And we did... I also did if you guys remember the All-Star, the movie with the All-Star cast, Tale of Despero, that failed and took the video game adaptation with it. That was me also.
You took the game with it, or
the movie went badly and the game nobody bought it. So, but I was already gone by the time that happened because our publisher declared bankruptcy, owing my studio $2 million. I realized that it was not going to end well there, and I took off. And I now work in virtual reality. Well, I work with simulators, and part of my job is virtual reality, so I get to play with virtual reality. I've also been an indie video game developer, developing games mostly for PC. Yes,
I was gonna say that.
Yeah, there we go. And I'm also I've had some things published for certain editions of D&D, and also now I'm a writer as well. This is my novel, Blood Creek Witch. Sequel comes out next month, Blood Creek Beast. To make sure I'm working on the third book right now, so I get the titles mixed up. But anyway, and I just found out last week this is a Whitney Award finalist. So
nice.
I guess maybe I'm getting the knack of this writing thing. So.
Yeah.
And lots of short stories and everything. So anyway, that's me.
I think that deserves a golf clap. Everybody.
Anyway.
Thank you guys. You guys are so awesome.
We're going to have fun. We are totally going to have fun.
The whole room golf clap. That makes me so happy. You have no idea.
the Thunderdome.
The Blunderdome? Okay.
I don't know how to follow that. I'm a dungeon master, and I designed a magic system for my homebrew. And when I designed it, I started to realize that it was a magic system that only an engineer could love, because I'm an engineer. And
I played the hero game system where you had to divide by fractional numbers. So
no, you have to construct your spells. There's components that you learn, and it's all about optimizing the time and the spell point cost to get the effect that you're looking for. I played a game earlier today of it, and we spent 3 minutes figuring out how to teleport 50 feet down this cliff.
It literally would have been faster to walk down the cliff.
Sounds like a party.
And so it is available online. My blog is Mindweave RPG, and originally my intention was to use the blog as an engine to promote this system that I was developing. But it's not a great system. I recommend 5e before my system, and so now I write modules for 5e. And so that's what this is. This is my most popular. It's the Rotating Labyrinth. And I have a few others that I'm kind of proud of. And they're all available DriveThruRPG. Most of them are free. So that's what I've got.
Sweet. My name is Lee Yeager, and yes, that is the same name as the anime character from Attack on Titan. It's not a stage name. That's my actual name.
You had it first, dang it.
And I was so honored that they knew of me and that they named their protagonist after me.
But have the royalty checks arrived yet?
Every day. My wife, no, seriously, my wife calls me up one day. She's like, Aaron, you gotta go on Netflix. She knows I love anime. And I'm like, okay, it's Attack on Titan. I'm like, no way! Like, what are the odds, right? Because like Aaron is like a Jewish name, Yeager's a German name. What's the chance I'd ever have an anime character named after me? So I was tickled pink. At that point, I was like, I've crested. It's all downhill from here. So I am, I'm a pilot. I'm a DJ radio host. I'm a set builder. I'm a producer. I'm a director. I am an author. I write anime-style harem comedies. I'm dead serious. Why are you laughing? No, my books, you get to choose which girl the guy ends up with.
Oh.
Yeah, it's like choose your own adventure, but awesomer. You can have, like, my books are on Amazon. I have some business cards here if you guys are interested now. And yeah, like, several of you know me already, so I'll just say it, you know. At night, I put on a cape and cowl and I fight crime. So there we go.
All right, so I guess we're.
Not major crimes like jaywalking.
Oh, yes.
At night.
Thou
Stuff
shalt
that I can
not.
handle.
You jaywalk
I
at
go
night.
out there and I clean up the street, literally. I'm like an unpaid janitor. Awesome.
All right, so magic systems in games. So what sort of things are you guys wanting to hoping to come away with tonight? What would you like to discuss?
I would like to know how you approach building a system for a RPG as opposed to how you would approach it for a novel.
Okay. Do you mind if we start with just kind of general principles?
Sure, let's go for it.
Okay, so here's what I've prepped for general principles. So whenever you're designing magic, be it for a game or an RPG or a novel or whatever, you want to ask yourself 4 fundamental questions. First question is, who can use it? This is actually a huge deal. Can everyone use magic, or can only certain people? If only certain people can use it, you've created 2 different classes, right? And if you've created one class that's much more powerful than another, that's going to have a radical alteration on the society of your world, right? Like in the Harry Potter world, wizards are clearly better than muggles. Like, it's not even an opinion, it's mathematics, right? So, like, and that makes a big difference, because, like, in the real world, all the different races are pretty much the same. But in this world, one race is more powerful. So do they dominate the other races? Are they hunted by the other races? There's lots of ways you can go. But who can use magic is going to fundamentally alter radically your world. Second question you want to ask is, what can it do? All right? Magic needs rules. If it doesn't have rules, then it's going to feel very cheap whenever it does things. It's going to be like, oh wait, they can reverse time? I didn't know they could do that. It's not going to feel earned. And sci-fi is magic. Technobabble is magic. All right. So like anytime you're talking about a fantastic element, it's, as far as our discussion, it's magic. Okay. So what can it do? The more powerful you make it, the more it's going to be really hard to have your characters solve a problem without it feeling really cheap, right? I generally prefer less powerful magics, but that's not necessary. Just keep in mind, as you scale up in power, you're gonna have to scale up your threats too, right? There's a reason why Superman, if he fights a bank robber, it's kind of pathetic, right? Yeah, you laugh, right? Superman has to fight like Darkseid because that's the only thing that can even possibly challenge him. So you're going to have to equal the threat to whatever power level you give your persons. Third question you want to ask yourself is, what is the cost? This is very important. If magic is effortless, it's going to feel very cheap. Now, sometimes that can be a good thing. One of the books that I wrote, the Wisteria series, I intentionally made the magic cheap. Like the women of the island had magic, they were born with it, they didn't have to learn it, and they just used it to dominate the men. And so when the men rose up and overthrew the women, I wanted it to feel cheap because I wanted the reader to feel, the ire of the oppressed underclass. So you can use that to your advantage. It doesn't have to be. But generally, you want costs to be proportional. So like if your wizard can, do about what a real world tank can do, make it so that it costs about as much material as a real world tank. Or else everyone in your army is tanks. Right? And maybe you want to do that. That can be fun too. But what does it cost? And costs can be learning. How long does it take to master the art? It can be materials, right? It can be, it can even be internal, like it exhausts them. Like I can use magic to move a bunch of boulders, but it's going to make me as weary as if I just picked them up myself and moved them around. So always be asking, what is the cost? And then the fourth question you want to ask are, what are the limitations? What can't it do? This is always going to be more interesting than what it can do. And this is where you want to be, there's a few things you want to be real careful of, right? Like, if your characters can time travel, you're probably going to break your story. because then it's like the time turner. So why don't they just go back when Voldemort was a kid and just arrest him then, right? Or once Star Trek, it's like, wait, you can time travel? Well, why did you ever lose a war ever if you can time travel? Well, it's against the law. We'll go back and change the law, right? That I would say, as a general, you can't. Now that's not to say you cannot do these things, but it's like plutonium, right? You've got to be real careful with it. Be very careful with time travel. Be very careful with abilities that allow things to come back from the dead, and be very careful with like immortality. Any of those kinds of things are really, if you're not handling them very carefully, can break your story and can break your world. It can make it so the world has no consequences. It's like Dragon Ball, where people die and they literally just go to a waiting room to come back. And it's like, so then when someone dies, it means nothing, right? The reader has no engagement, or the player or whatever, because they just know, oh, in 10 minutes they're just gonna, I'm just gonna swing back in, get blown up all over again.
But to argue with you, sorry,
no,
yes,
He's from
No,
Science Laws of Magic?
yeah. So
yeah, like Brandon Sanderson, he's my god.
yeah. Now this of course assumes that you're dealing in a situation with multiple players, or where you want
Right.
a symmetric. I mean, one of the big things. I mean, Magic the Gathering, or not Magic the Gathering, Mage the Ascension. They even went through. They're like, yeah, this. Wizards or mages in this game are way overpowered. A wizard, they even had a big essay about how a mage can turn an elder vampire into lawn furniture, and that may be the principle that you want, especially if all of the players in it are going to be, magic users. If you're dealing with a video game, especially single-player video
Right,
game, which is my area, that's the whole time travel. Hey, let's go for it. That's a ripe thing. You've got.
Yeah, it won't ruin the story like BioShock Infinity, of course not.
Yeah, well, they wanted to design around it, but you've also got the Chrono Trigger and stuff like that, where that becomes a fascinating aspect. There was I'm trying to remember the game. It was an indie game about 10 years back. That was the whole point, where you could reverse time and you had to solve the puzzles.
Braid.
With that. Braid. Yeah, thank you. Braid.
Excellent game.
Yeah. So these are good principles if you're doing board game, dice and paper role playing game, or massively multiplayer online game. But a lot of that you want to break it.
And these are just questions you want to ask yourself as you're designing your system.
Right. The cost, I love the cost in Mage the Ascension, the cost for that, where you can also wipe yourself out as you're, trying to do the magic. That was, one of the things that's I thought was very interesting to me is, Dungeons and Dragons, which, a lot of people hate the magic system. But the thing that was cool with that, or that was interesting, anyone read Appendix N, the book Appendix N, or the blogs? No one?
No.
Okay.
Which edition of D&D are we talking specifically?
Well, that one was actually talking about first edition D&D. What they did was they took Appendix N from the Dungeon Master's Guide, and he went through and he read all those sources. It was like Gary Gygax's bibliography, and everyone was making an assumption, especially when the Tolkien estate was suing them, that D&D was just trying to do Lord of the Rings, but doing it poorly. And anyway, this guy was going back and he was going over all these old pulp sources that Gygax was saying, this is where I came from, and it was really fascinating because it's like, of course people knew that he kind of borrowed the magic system from Vance, but like the different spells, the different monsters, all these things, you could do all these different sources. They were taken from all these different books, and the point of D&D was to allow players to emulate all of these different stories, not just Lord of the Rings. And that's why you had the magic system from hell that they had. But that was part of it, was they were trying to do a GURPS type thing way back in 1972, 4, when they were first putting it together, because the idea was, we want to emulate this fiction. We want people to be able to be like John Carter of Mars and all these other things, and so that was...
You probably do want to tap into an existing expectation for your audience, just to smooth things along. It can be fun to make something completely from scratch that's completely original, but the downside to that is then you've now made a very high barrier to entry. They're going to have to learn all this new system. Whereas if you copy kind of the wand magic from Harry Potter, your audience is going to instantly kind of go, oh, okay, it's like Harry Potter. Here we go.
Yeah.
You
need your goals. So, what are some of the principles that you think of when working on magic?
I'm glad you brought up Braid, because in games, my favorite thing to do with Magic is to make it a puzzle that you can solve. So I remember playing first edition Dungeons and Dragons with my dad. I would read that spell book like twice a week, the list of spells, because I wanted to know when we got into a situation which of these spells I was going to use to solve that problem, right? Oh, there's a bunch of bandits coming. I don't think we can handle them. Layman's Tiny Hut. I know, that's my spell. And so knowing the list was how I solved the puzzles then, right? But I think that a Magic system that is more engaging to the player gives you the opportunity to solve your puzzles more than just picking off of a list, right? And so in Braid, you knew exactly what your Magic did, right? It turned forward time when you moved forward, and turned time back when you moved backwards. And then puzzles. You solve puzzles using those principles. So I think the simplest Magic system for a game gives you a set of principles that you use to solve puzzles. And so you need to know what kind of puzzles you want solved and what the Magic is going to do to help you with those puzzles. Portal is a good example. You have Magic. You have a wand that creates portals. And then these are the puzzles you're going to solve.
And that game it handles that concept brilliantly.
Yeah.
There's another one, a series, and in fact, I think they're doing a Kickstarter for game number 2 by Hanako Games called Magical Diary. And it's kind of a combination of dungeon crawler and not really a dating sim, but kind of a visual novel type thing. It's actually really good. She was a big fan of also Mage the Ascension, and that was part of the part of her thought process. But the whole thing is it's a Connecticut school, so it's not Hogwarts that you're going to, and but you've got the whole kind of the life sim type thing where you're doing your areas of study and who you're socializing with, what you learn from them. So your mundane school skills, your spell skills, and of course your relationships and who you're going to date. And it's probably best not to date the demon dude, even though if you don't know he's a demon dude, because that will not end well no matter what. But and then you've got your exams, which are down in the dungeon, and they're all puzzle based. But the designer Georgina Bensley is the designer for that. She's made it so that there is no one single answer to any of the puzzles. She's very deliberately made it so that it's very open-ended as to how you can solve this problem. If there's a pit on the floor, well, if you've got like a ability to levitate, it's really easy. But there's other things you can do, like do an earthquake and cause blocks to fall down and fill in the pit. You can conjure a plank to go across it. You can use another spell to go through the walls on this side and come out the other side. So there's all these different options, or anything else you can think of. I mean, it's really designed to be open-ended, and that's kind of the puzzle-solving thing. And that's, again, the Magic system that you design has to meet the demands, or what effect you want to get, what you're trying to simulate, what type of style. If you're simulating something from a book, that's going to have different needs than if you're trying to simulate all books, or if you're coming up with your own ideas, like, again, Mage the Ascension, which I keep bringing up. Who's played that one, by the way? Okay, so a few of us.
And then there was one more I forgot.
Oh.
How reliable is it?
Ooh.
Can it go wrong? Can it go wild? Is it semi-sentient? Is it sentient?
But that's effectively kind of it's a cost. It's more of a risk.
Yeah.
There's a risk of it.
Yeah. What are the risks?
Yeah. It's a risk that comes along.
Is it repeatable? If you do the incantation the same way every time, will you always get the same result? Or does the Magic have mood swings?
And how the same does it have to be?
Right. And if you do it exactly the same, is it going to do different things on different occasions? So that's another question to ask.
Yeah. So.
Trying to remember. Oh, you said what you're trying to evoke. What you're trying to, and so that's the other important thing in a game, besides how it helps you solve puzzles, is it should also feel awesome, right? People don't want to have Magic that feels lame, right? So if it's not helping you solve a puzzle, it's got to at least be blowing stuff up, or turning things to ice, so that it feels like you're a wizard.
Yeah.
To that end, would you be disappointed as a player if I tried to make something where it was really mundane, but I tried to give you options where you can grow a bean sprout, but I tried to give you a lot of options where you could do that to have big consequences? Would that?
Yeah, I would be okay with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I remember one of my favorite things in Ocarina of Time was like going around planting the magic beans.
And then you water
No,
them.
and then you come back and in the future and they're all grown up and you can explore. That's a very very lame little power, but I really enjoyed that.
Well, there's a
But
thing.
it feels awesome because you come back later and you've had an impact on the world.
That's a huge thing, and I've seen this was a. In fact, this was there was a series Gamma Center that Ernie Adams did. It was Bad Game Designer, No Twinkie was the series, which I recommend if you guys, especially if you do any video game development, look up that series. It's on GammaSutra.com. Make sure it's GAMA. Don't find something else. Anyway,
Sorry, what was the series?
it's bad game. I think a Bad Game Designer or Bad Game Developer. I think it's Bad Game Designer, No Twinkie. And he just got all these, what he calls is these Twinkie denial states, which are all these game design blunders. And you guys, if you play video games, it's like, the unskippable cutscene is one of the ones that they have. But he was talking, and I think it was in that one, but there were some others where he was talking about some of the things where magic, systems break. But one of his big complaints, and it's mine too, is that oftentimes in video games especially, but it also gets to be, you're the concern about it being overpowered. Is magic ends up feeling very mundane. Like you play a sorceress in a Diablo or something like that, and it's just like, okay, I could be shooting arrows or I could be shooting these, fire blasts, and the effect is basically the same. It's just bang, 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 spam that, whatever. And
It has to feel different.
yeah, and it is. It's just like, oh, and I keep running until I run out of mana, and then I, do more mana potions, or I do something else to give me back.
They just guzzle them. Right?
I know,
They're
and
just
and that's an issue I have in all games, because that's one of the big, the game balance is this huge thing. And I'm like, I want to do this thing. I want magic to feel magical. You're talking about puzzles. There's a very old game, I think it's available on GOG.com, that was done by LucasArts back in the day, called Loom. You're nodding your head. You played it?
Yeah.
It was a one where you were weavers, and it was done with notes of music, and kind of Ocarina of Time type idea. But it was an early precursor to that, where
What's this called?
Loom,
How do you spell that?
LOOM. And it was a very short adventure game. I mean, I was very disappointed because I paid full price for it, and that was like $45 back in the 90s, which is probably twice as much now. And we got it, and one of the two discs didn't work, so we had to send off to LucasArts, or Lucasfilm Games actually at the time, and we had to wait a week for the other disc to come out. We got both discs, we tried it, and within 4 hours we played through the entire game, and we were like, okay, that sucked.
What the heck?
But it's a beautiful game, but again, it was an adventure game, not a role-playing game, and the whole idea was using this spell repertoire that you've developed in order to solve these puzzles in the game. Yeah. It was a really a beautiful story and everything that goes with it.
Quick question.
Yeah.
To that end of it having impact, what did you think about the magic in Dark Souls? Did that strike a good balance of power but limited use?
I'm gonna have to have someone else, because I didn't play a whole lot of Dark Souls, and I was always doing melee stuff.
I don't like to play the casters in Dark Souls, so I don't know that I feel like it was done very well. But I do use it as a backup.
Okay.
I don't know what else to say about that. It's pretty limited how much you can do.
Yeah.
And so there's the limitations and things, but
I didn't know if that made it feel different enough from the archery.
I feel like the purpose of it's really different from the archery. But I feel like the purpose of the magic in Dark Souls is to put an easy mode on the game. It's a lot easier to kill things from far away and take it really slow when you have magic. If you're not using the magic, you run out of resources fast. You can't
Okay.
Yeah.
you can't run away as easily when you're not using the magic, and so it's a different purpose.
Yeah, I mean, how you design the magic. I mean, if you want a world where magic is really utility, again, it's lower powered. It's pretty much, and the magic users, again, you got the reliability like you do in most video games, because, okay, video games, here's a hint. I learned this the hard way with my beta testers for computer RPG I did called Frayed Knights, The Skull of Smackdown. Having any sort of randomness in a video game, actually players really hate it. A little bit of randomness as to whether they, crit, or if they very rarely crit or very rarely miss, they're okay, or if the difference in damage is whether you do 1,644 points of damage or 1,632 points of damage, they're okay with that. But really they want, this monster goes down in 4 hits. And if it, maybe 5, and if I got lucky 3, but if it takes 6, like D&D where you roll the D20 and you got a 40% chance of hitting, they hate that with the burning heat of 1,000 suns. Learn that the hard way. This is a piece of advice.
So tell me about this counterexample.
Okay.
Unless we're going somewhere else.
Oh well, the thing that I like if you have it very utility based, it has to be very reliable. It has to be.
It does the same thing every time.
It's the same thing every time.
It grows
it's boring.
a plant.
It's simple.
Yeah.
But yeah, what I do like is the idea of having magic be magic, which kind of means it's unreliable and overpowered, and possibly dangerous to use. It depends upon the type of game you're trying to simulate, or what you want the style to be. Again, Mage was a real good example of that. I'm not sure what others there were that was like that, but there are ways of doing that, especially stuff where it's the one-offs like the beans and stuff like that.
I think one of the areas where the magic makes the most fun is when in your world design. Right, and I think Avatar: The Last Airbender is a great example of that, where they took the magic and then they made very logical steps of how would this change the world if there were people who could do blank, right? So the firebenders, they just have an unlimited free supply of flame. How would that affect their culture? Well, they would have an industrial revolution where they could have where they could make tanks, and you don't need all the chemical explosives, just a little slip for a guy to go through, and they would have boilers and steam-driven technology, because it would be very cheap for them. Metallurgy would right, and
have lightning benders around the clock making
electricity for the cities, and if you have that much access to free heat, I mean, metallurgy would be just a cinch for you. So they're a very industrialized kind of nation. And then you have the earthbenders who can just move around the stone, and you see them all the time using that in their transportation. Trolley cars with a stone base, and they have a guy. There's no motor. There's just a guy in the back going, and just they're sending goods up, and they could make their cities ridiculously high because they can stack the stone safely in ways that, and if anyone else tried to do it, they'd kill themselves, trying to make it. So, Avatar: The Last Airbender is a very good example of taking that. Once you've decided how your magic works, then you take the next step. How would that affect my world, right? If people can make health potions that just instantly heal you, how would that change warfare, right? If there are
how would
ways
that change
of
workplace safety,
right? If you have magic that can make you live for very long periods of time, how would that change family structure? Right? This is where it really gets fun, right? Because once you have your magic, then you create this world that's a logical extension of that magic, and you don't have to fill in the A, B, C, D for your audience. They'll enjoy it if they just sit back and go, "Oh, I get it, right? Like, why that totally makes sense because they can do this, so of course it would be like that." And you don't have to explain it; just have it be. People love that. People eat that up. Good world building is really, really fun because it makes it very immersive, right?
Yeah, another thing, going back to, you had the question, and I guess we probably want to open things up for more questions here, but you had a question about games, doing it in games versus in a novel. I'm also not necessarily of the Brandon Sanderson, thing. We're having, if your book is about magic system and it's core to the book and all that, I think that's very important. You can also do a magic system where there's different ways of approaching it, as long as you think about the world building. Unlike Harry Potter, but that one doesn't really have a magic system. It's just, oh, I learned this spell, and will it be useful later on in this book?
I bet it will.
I'll bet it will. But you don't need necessarily to do that. In a game system, however, you do need to have those sort of limits and think about how it would how things would apply. The other thing I love to do, and again, this is a video game thing, but I love to have the AI behave as nasty and as cheap as the players. So, as soon as the monsters figure out that the spellcaster back there is the one doing fireballs, guess who gets targeted with everything? It's
Cast silence,
you
cast
get
blind.
you get one spell and then suddenly incoming, something like that.
It's one of the costs.
Yeah, it's one of the costs. Well,
Then we will fight in the shade.
and it flows naturally, though. I mean, if you've got that, you can have it flow. It's like, yes, there's a great song based on D&D. I don't know if you ever heard the song "Always the First to Die." They're talking about no one's playing the magic user, and it was first edition, and then they're like, so they said, well, yeah, you'll suck at level 1, but you'll rock at level 9, and so they keep going out, and he keeps with his one magic missile and light, and he keeps getting killed like everything. And finally, he's just like, screw this game, I'm not playing. He never gets up beyond level 3. And
This game sucks, man.
this game sucks.
This is bullcrap.
But anyway, that's something. I mean, you can have everything from a very, very simple, being able to say, oh, you've got a game, and guess what? Once per day, or once per game session, or whatever, here's the special ability that you've got. You've got the ability to, and if it's not a one where you're competing against other players, you can be kind of overpowered. It's like, once per day, you can override the GM's roll and turn a hit into a miss, or vice versa. Something like that. Very, very simple. Doesn't have much by way of rules, but that's a fun little ability, and it gives the players some extra power over the game. But you do, like I said, you do need to have rules. Whereas sometimes in books, the rules may not be quite so concrete. So,
I think sometimes we have systems. I'm glad you mentioned the change the die roll and things
Mm-hmm.
that we don't call magic, right? We think about magic as the fireball and the wizard summoning a water elemental or whatever. But we have systems that are magic systems that we don't call magic, right? The tinker making a little robot to go to take care of a task. That is magic, right?
All superpowers are magic.
All superpowers are magic.
Mutant powers.
The Force. There's lots of things that are magic that we don't call magic.
Pretty much everything that starts
follow a lot of these same rules in the game.
Yeah.
And so you said technobabble is magic, and that's another example.
So okay, questions.
Yeah.
We just answered everyone's question. Either we bored everyone to tears, and I'm really, really sorry. Oh, I think I saw his hand first, but okay,
He
great.
was visually thinking it before you were.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm actually doing a bit of an interesting thing. I'm more trying to create a universe, and the rule of the universe is magic is only limited by two things, which is your imagination and your understanding.
Okay.
And the basic concept behind that was, for a long time, it was thought possible that mankind could fly, until the Edison, gosh, not about
Wright
The Wright
brothers.
Wright brothers. Thank you, I knew it. Until the Wright brothers came along and proved that theory wrong. And I mean, granted, it wasn't necessarily man who's flying, but we now can fly. Anyways, point being, one of the worlds I was actually wanting to do for a game of some nature was one where they killed death.
So
And
there's no death.
There is no death
Okay.
for anything.
All right.
I was just kind of curious, how would you possibly go about doing that in a session or a game?
Well, if you remove death as a consequence, then you open up things that are normally lesser consequences, but now become the major consequences, right? So, like being imprisoned would be horrific for an immortal, right?
We dump you in a concrete bunker
Into
for
the
eternity.
ocean. Yeah, or we shoot you into the sun.
Yeah.
Right?
Basically, everything
No,
they
seriously,
do
that's
is
why. So anytime someone like, you can't kill Wolverine, shoot him in the sun.
Yeah.
Just read
You
that.
could never kill the Hulk, shoot him in the sun. But so just because death is gone doesn't mean there won't be other consequences that can be horrific. Losing your memory, right? Being ostracized from the other immortals, so that now you're alone for eternity.
Reputation.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So just because death is gone doesn't mean it just means that those other things will now become the worst thing.
Yeah, that's really a world building and think of it. And what I like to do again, bridging the gaming gap. I like to think of everyone, as the world. I used to work for a multi-level marketing company as a computer programmer there, and doing the whole downline thing, and I thought people gamed the system really bad with massively multiplayer games. All the cheats and crap that people would and the exploits that they find. Those guys have nothing on these people doing multi-level marketing with, Amway, or any of these other ones. It is, these guys are the kings of cheap, and they will use every exploit, and they don't care if they ruin your company. They're just moving on to the next company, And so I learned very quickly that people will abuse the system, and if you've got any sort of thing where you have a magic in your world, start thinking like a totally ruthless power gamer who doesn't give a crap about anything but their own personal, increase, and say, put that in the world and see where it goes. If you start having that thing, think of death. What does that happen to inheritance? What I'd see very quickly, limits on having children. It is unless.
It's a power game.
Yeah,
Malthus was right.
Exactly. It is.
We cannot fill the world with immortals.
That's right, and it's going to be a case of there again those other punishments. The person in charge is, you must be. They've handled it in Vampire the Masquerade. That was a big example, because if you have too many immortal vampires in town,
then the food stock doesn't last.
Yes. So think through things like that in your gaming world too. You want your gaming world to seem visceral.
And if they don't stay healthy,
so
healthcare costs.
5 minutes. All right.
Their society would be built around avoiding those things.
Yeah.
Rather than avoiding death.
So, Aaron, with your comment on time travel, you talked about avoiding it, and I generally agree, but I do...
I said be careful with it.
Okay, yes. Okay, be careful with it. I think an excellent example of being careful with it is the time traveler's wife.
Okay.
Which fits in with everything else you guys were saying about having a cost for that, because he had literally no control.
Yeah.
And so even though he was able to do stuff, every single time he time traveled, it put him in an awkward situation.
Right.
And then later on put his wife in a very awkward situation and nearly split their marriage. So.
Right, and you can have some really fun karmic balance magic systems where, every time you do something to help somebody, someone else will get hurt somewhere. And so that no matter what you do, there's always a net zero gain in the universe.
Yeah.
So I understand about balancing a magic system in terms of the world and in terms of story. I'm curious if there's any extra considerations to make sure it's balanced for the experience of the players. Specifically tabletop, there's nothing more annoying than playing a system where the wizard is OP and you really wanted to do the fun ranger.
Right.
Yeah, it really needs to feel different. So the system I built, wizards are really versatile. They can be powerful, but spells take a particularly long amount of time to do and can be interrupted, and especially at early levels you can only do a few small things. And so they need to feel different. If someone, not be more powerful, but feel different. So if someone's playing your wizard, you want that to be a completely different experience than playing the fighter. You don't want them to do the fighter's amount of damage, maybe a little less at a distance, right? You don't want them to be sneaky like the thief. A lot of the complaints you get is when the wizard can do what everyone else can do, right? They can be sneaky and do the damage and be invincible. And so you need it to feel like a different experience.
You can also compartmentalize.
And then it doesn't matter how well the power is balanced, because people who want that feel will go for it as long as it's close.
Yeah.
Or
And also-
I was more concerned about the other players. I get the exact feel I want for the wizard,
Yeah.
but I'm pissing off everybody
And so it's
else.
the same. It's the same for the other players. If they
can
feel
do is-
different, then they'll want to do that for the feel, even if they're a little bit weaker.
Yeah, well, again, first edition thief in Dungeons and Dragons, it was by the time you hit about 5th or 6th level, you were useless Okay.
Oh, I love being the thief in first edition.
I did too, but at that point it was like, oh, I want to scale the wall, and the magic user just casts fly.
Yeah.
I'm going to hide in the shadows. Well, the magic user just casts invisibility. Well, I'm going to try and scout out this stuff. Oh, we just cast wizard eye or some sort of other sort of divination spell to, and so you're just like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do? Of course, the little-known ability they did to try and counter that, I think, in first edition was, at a certain level, thieves could actually read magic user scrolls and could start doing. It's like, so I could cast the fireballs too. Dang it.
That's a good point, because you can have a magic bow for the ranger that he may not be able to actually use the magic, but he can use a magic bow that has magic in it. So just because he's not a wizard doesn't mean he can't use magic.
The other thing you can do is you can compartmentalize it so that you have the magic users have their own realm, that magic can do things that other people can't, but magic doesn't do things that they do. So
really clarify the expertise.
right, so like for example, an archer shoots a bow, a wizard can go into dreams and find out things that no one else can know. Right, the fighter can swing a sword. The sorcerer can read minds. Right, give them their own distinct compartments that they all function in, so that no one's stepping on each other's toes.
And then you can also have the stuff where it's, again, the magic user may be way kind of over. I keep bringing mage for those few who played it, where they would accumulate paradox, and if they did something, you start messing with reality, and eventually reality smacks back, and it could smack you so hard it could wipe you out completely. So very quickly, a good mage player learned to be very judicious about, it's like, yes, I can do this, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to pull out a gun and shoot him instead, because it's a lot safer than trying to cast a fireball or something. Nice.
So how would you go about balancing a system that where I pose you a system? Literally, the only choice is to go into the magic system. There's various sections of the magic system that all do various things. Now, the game is very PvP centric. It is all about beating other people. How would you go about balancing between the magic stuff?
Playtest the crap out of it first off. You have to make sure that, because until you do, you might you can work out a lot in math, and you could say, damage per second, whatever. But playtesting, and get the really nasty, players
who find the meanest SOBs you can.
Yeah, and say, how can I abuse the crap out of this system and let them abuse it and do what you can.
You can also introduce counterplay, right? It takes 3 seconds for the sorcerer to cast their spell. If you hit them, even with 1 point of damage during that time, it cancels
It takes 3 seconds for the strong spells, but 1
Right.
second for this spell.
So you can introduce elements of counter. Overwatch is actually really good at this. You can introduce elements of counterplay so that, yes, the wizards are powerful, but if you know how to dance around them and continually interrupt them, then you can outplay them, even though you're not a magic user. That's another option.
I mean, the usual approach is a magic user is a glass cannon. They're the artillery. And artillery is vulnerable, but very dangerous when you can bring it to bear. And that's, kind of a good rock, paper, scissors type approach for things.
And so in your case, they're all magic. You could do a different rock, paper, scissors.
Right.
You could have tanky mages who just do armor and then can't do a whole lot and need to get close. And you could have travel mages that you could have the artillery mages, but
Yeah, in PvP, there's different things than if you're doing a cooperative game. Cooperative game, one of the big things that you want more than anything else is to require this interdependency. The mages can't team up in a team of just 5 wizards together.
Five white mages, it can't be done.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
Is that a challenge?
anyway, and have them blitz through the dungeon better than. You really want something where it's like, okay, here's the mage, but without the fighter, the mage is dead.
Right.
Without the cleric, without the rogue doing the scouting, the mages can't target, and they're also you want to make sure that you can have all this stuff where they can't. You don't want a magic user to be able to do everything, at least not do everything well, and you want to give them some vulnerabilities.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't always the main consideration in video game design is time, right? That's your main currency.
It totally depends. If you're playing something that's a turn-based, and I've played lots of turn-based stuff that's not really. You can come up with whatever you want as long as you got, again, the cost and the risk to counter it.
Right. Like I can imagine a system where the wizards are powerful, but they have to spend a lot of time gathering the materials they need for their spells, compared to like the archers that just have to buy some arrows.
Yeah.
I could imagine. So a time,
but that's-
so that you see how you're using.
However,
using
having
time as a
that sort of
currency?
time, that's usually handled in like you don't want to bore the player. That's the
Yeah.
first thing you say.
It's
you
dangerous.
must grind,
It's dangerous to start taking player time. as
grind
currency.
for 15 hours in order to be able to cast these 5 spells. I mean, no, that's well, okay. There's some online games, especially the browser,
Dude, I've played
free to
some
play.
Korean grinders that-
Yeah, that really do that. Or you can just pay $2 and you can accelerate that time. Okay, I think speaking of
We are out of
time,
time.
I think we are out of time.
So I doubt there's a rock for the room at this point.
I know, right?